For over 20 years, the hustle and bustle of London Bridge railway station hid a dark secret. Each commuter passing through on their way to work, stopping for a quick coffee, chatting to friends on the way for a day trip out of London, the cleaner sweeping the platforms, the train-obsessed child excited for the ride, the elderly ticket collector checking his watch, all unnoticed by the other travellers as they run late for a train. But if we took a second to stop and look closer at that ticket collector, in his peaked hat, focused on his watch, not looking up, not giving a wave, and no chance of a good morning, he passes through the crowds, tearing tickets and remembering his past. A past made of death, destruction, and the very worst of humanity. The old man, on the way to his next tea break, has killed hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. Cutting down men, women and children, indulging in depravity and suffering, escaping justice for over 60 years. This humble ticket inspector has worn a uniform before, that of the SS. Come with me as we look at the very depths of humanity, cruelty, and a story that spans 80 years. This is the story of Anthony Sawoniuk. Whole life orders are a significant aspect of the UK justice system, reserved for the most heinous of crimes. These sentences mean that the convicted person will spend the rest of their life in prison without the possibility of parole. With some of this country's most infamous criminals and some of those whose crimes have faded from public consciousness. There has been a total of 116 handed out, with 89 of these still alive and serving time behind the bars of UK's most notorious prisons. This series will examine those 112 men and 4 women, their lives, motives, crimes, captures, trial, and life in prison. Welcome to No Parole, Britain's Lifers. Anthony Sawoniuk was born on the 7th of March 1921 in Damachava, Poland, now Damachava, Belarus. Sitting alongside the Bug River, the spa town sits alongside the two countries' modern borders. Originally part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the border town switched hands between many empires, but became part of the Second Polish Republic, born out of the ruins of World War I and the Polish-Soviet War. Its population was over 90% Jewish, not uncommon for any town in Poland during this time. It flourished in relative peace that was brought at the end of the Great War. Born into this time was Andrzej Pelagia Sawoniuk, a single mother. Uncommon for this time, it is unclear who Andrzej's father is. However, rumours swirled around the small town that the local schoolmaster, Józef Jakub, a Jewish man who employed Anthony's mother as a cleaner, was most likely the father to the newborn boy. Andrzej had a fairly tough childhood by our standards. Poor and without any land of their own, the Sawoniuks lived in a small wooden bungalow on the outskirts of town. Damachava's main business was tourism. People would come from miles around to soak in the cool fresh air and reset in the various spas of the town. These spas were mainly ran by Jewish families, with the non-Jewish residents working in agriculture and service jobs to the hotels, spas and restaurants around the town. Because this split in wealth did exist, with the Gentile neighbours becoming envious of their Jewish friends. Andrzej helped his mother, who worked as a cleaner or doing other odd jobs around the town. During this time he became friends with a young Jewish boy, Ben Zion Blustein. They enjoyed their time sneaking off from all chores as young boys do, running through the streets of Damachava, playing in the nearby stream alongside Andrzej's house. Friends not separated by their faith, wealth or any other silly thing, but joined in friendship by what made them the same. The joy of childhood, the enjoyment of beauty of nature. But within a few short years, these two boys grew into men and would be split, one down the path of depravity and inhumanity and death.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting the European side of World War II, with the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his French counterpart declaring war on Germany. 17 days after the Wehrmacht goose-stepped across the western Polish border, in the east, Soviet troops marched into Polish territory. This was from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an agreement that had been negotiated just a few months earlier between Nazi Germany and the Soviets. Stalin had feigned concern for the ethnic Ukrainians and Belarusians as a pretext for this invasion. Two regimes had negotiated spheres of influence over Europe, with the Russians gaining large swathes of Eastern Europe, including the small village where Ben and Andrei lived. The town was right along the new border of the two dictatorships, sitting in the Soviet side. The Soviets favoured the ethnic Belarusians, who typically were Jewish, more well off and already better educated, while the ethnic Poles, to which Andrei belonged, were further pushed down the social and economic standings. However, despite the enforced discrimination against families like Andrei's, with them being passed over for food or even kicked out of their homes, families like Ben would leave blankets, food and money for their neighbours in the dead of night to avoid detection by the Soviet occupiers. For 2 years, the small town of Damachava was under the boot heels of Russians, a tough life that was set on to only get worse, as on the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler ordered the start of the invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa. This would lead to the most destructive part of the war, seeing millions dead in just a few short years. The blitzkrieg across Polish, Ukrainian and Belarusian occupied Soviet territory left a wake of destruction, death and decay, with both Ben, a young Jewish man, and Andrei in fear for their lives as whole towns were burnt down and destroyed by the German Wehrmacht and SS. The town of Damachava heard the rolling of tanks and the stamping of jackboots enter its centre in 1941. Immediately, the Nazis took to rounding up all Jewish men, women and children, marching 50 of them to the centre of the town and executing them in front of their neighbours, friends and families, then marching the remaining 3,000 Jews into a ramshackle ghetto in the most run-down part of town. This area originally housed 500 residents, but now 3,000 plus were squeezed on top of each other, with little food or water, no protection against the coming winter, and disease was rife. The Germans continued pushing east and required the manpower to continue their attack on the Soviet Union, so took to hiring local men for Belarusian auxiliary police to implement terror and control over the local Jewish and non-Jewish peoples. Andrei and his brother Nikolai joined the Schutzmannschaften. Now, it's not known if the brothers joined out of a clear anti-Semitic hate, or rather as a way to find employment within the Nazi occupation, a chance to get some food and safety. A story of normal people pushed to extremes by a situation out of their control. There was nothing Andrei and his brother could do, right? Well, his half-brother Nikolai, upon learning of the killing of his Jewish friends and neighbours, he left the police force, standing upon the principles he held. A brave thing to do, unlike Andrei, who grew more cruel and evil as the meagre power he was given went to his head. A coward who bullied and attacked men, women and children. Late in September 1942, Andrei and other members of the police force entered the ghetto housing 3,000 Jews and marched them into a nearby pine forest, digging a mass grave and executing every single one. As this massacre took place, Andrei's childhood Jewish friend Ben and his family attempted to hide in a bunker they constructed. They spent several days in it, but the supply of water gave out and they were dying of thirst. Ben's stepfather committed suicide, but the others did not, and on the 9th day, Ben left the bunker. He survived by finding a way to join the specialists who were left alive by the Germans to work on their military bases in Damachava. Several of the specialists, including Ben, succeeded in escaping from the German base in the fall of 1942, and after considerable wandering in the Polesian forests, they joined a Soviet partisan unit. After a rather long screening process by the Partisan Brigade security, they were accepted as fighters. By this point, Andrei, through sheer cruelty, had risen through the ranks to commandant and been given a submachine gun, unlike the other officers with a rifle. He had, at one point, killed a 15-year-old girl after she refused his sexual advances. At a later mass execution of Jews, he had forced 15 other women to strip before shooting them in the back of the head and kicking their bodies into a mass grave. His final outrage, slaughtering 54 children in the local Jewish orphanage. This took his body count total to around 200. In July 1944, as the war turned in the favour of the Allies and the Red Army began to push back the occupying Nazi forces and retake territory in the west as they approached the small town of Damachava, Andrei fled towards Germany and joined the 30th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS. But like the coward he was, he deserted them and snuck back into Poland, using his Polish birth certificate to join the 10th Hussar Regiment of the Polish Second Corps. Little is known about the work the former butcher of innocent people did for Poland, but a year after the war ended, in 1946, Andrei settled in Hove, East Sussex, England, as a refugee fleeing. He eventually settled in a South London area called Dulwich in an attempt to avoid prosecution. The KGB, the secret police force of Soviet Russia, did suspect him of being a war criminal and taking part in the Holocaust, but due to the Cold War, Russia and the UK were not on information sharing terms. This was also due to the fact that Andrei had changed his name to Anthony, as well as a misspelling of his surname in KGB files. Andrei settled into life working at St Francis Hospital, and then in 1961 as a ticket inspector working for British Rail, believing he had escaped prosecution for these crimes against humanity. All those who could step forward against him were killed, either by his own hand or other Nazi collaborators. His hometown, Damachava, had had over 5,000 Jewish men, women and children before the war, and by the end, only 13 had survived. As the Cold War thawed and the West and the new Russian Federation began to share information and lists of suspected war criminals, with one of the top names passed along in 1994 was Anthony Sawoniuk. As the Cold War thawed, the West and the new Russian Federation began to share information and lists of suspected war criminals, with one of the top names passed along in 1994 was Anthony Sawoniuk. Cross-examining the names, it was found the closest match was an Anthony Sawoniuk, a ticket inspector in London Bridge Station, nicknamed by his colleagues as Tony the Pole, a grumpy and unkind man, but none of his colleagues or neighbours who witnessed the arrest of the now 76-year-old man from his East London flat. Rumours in the staff canteen and the streets swirled with speculation. Had Tony been pocketing cash from train tickets? Imagine the horror when opening a newspaper to see the man you may have shared lunch with or a kind hello was a depraved monster on the unfathomable scale, taking part in the darkest period of human history. Sawoniuk had by that time become a British citizen. He was tried at the Old Bailey in London in March 1999 on 2 specimen charges of murder with regard to the murder of Jews in the German-occupied hometown during World War II. During the trial, those who had survived bravely stepped forward to provide testimony and evidence against Andrei's crime. The jury travelled to Damachava and spoke to Fedor Zan, now aged 75 but in his 20s during the war. He took the jury through the snow-covered thick forest on the outskirts of town, where over 50 years ago he had heard screaming coming from somewhere as he collected firewood. The young Fedor headed towards the screams in the hopes of helping those in distress, only to witness Andrei standing before 15 naked women. Pointing his submachine gun towards the helpless women, he fired, mowing them down, and each one of them fell backwards into a pre-dug mass grave. Another witness to the crimes, Alexander Bagley, a 13-year-old boy at the time, now 68, with a lifetime between those events, recalled as he had seen Andrusha, a nickname, shoot a Jewish woman and 2 men in the back of the head after stripping them. He recalled how Andrusha had placed his pistol on the back of their head and shot each one, pushing them into a mass grave with his knee. When questioned if he could be mistaken to the identity of the shooter in his old age, he is quoted as saying, "I remember it beautifully." At one point during his cross-examination, Sawoniuk lost his temper. He shouted at the jury, "Andrusha, Andrusha, Andrusha! They only say Andrusha, Andrusha! No one else killed no one. Only Andrusha. Everyone else just watches and claps. Only they pick on me." Nutting, a member of the prosecution, piped up, "No, Mr. Sawoniuk, it isn't fair, is it? So many were guilty, and it is only Andrusha who stands trial. There must be many thousands of old men in Europe who committed crimes worse than those committed by Sawoniuk. Some of those members of the Einsatzgruppen actually committed the main massacre in Damachava must still be alive today, reading about the case in the newspapers, so Sawoniuk is certainly unlucky to be held accountable in this way." Taking the stand next was Andrei's childhood friend Ben Zion Blustein. He had the typical aura of a Holocaust survivor. Old, tough, and in no means feeble, with an air of confidence, hiding a subconscious of vulnerability. A man whose understanding of how dark the world can be has led him to appreciate the beauty of life in his new home in Israel with his wife and son. But before that, I'd just like to provide some background on Ben and his time during World War II. This may deviate from the series a little bit, but I feel these stories are always worth telling to preserve history so that it may never be repeated. Ben had been part of a partisan group fighting Nazis until 1944. when, meeting up with the Red Army forces liberating western Belarusia, he and his friend Boris Grinstein joined the Soviet forces in Boboruskik. But before they could do that, they both travelled to Blustein's hometown of Damachava to give the names of Nazi collaborators like Anthony to the Soviet government, which helped later to lead to the very court case in which he stood now in 1999. Ben was deployed to Ukraine as part of an infantry regiment, taking part in the fighting on the outskirts of the city of Lublin in modern-day Poland. He entered the death camp of Majdanek. Entering the camp to see the depths of human suffering, he is quoted as saying, "Stunned, we stared at the scene around us, watchtowers erected next to gloomy barracks, and near them, it appeared to me, bodies were lying. When I came close to a barrack, I saw shadows of men, sunken and wrapped in rags, who were lying against the entrance to the barrack. I began speaking Yiddish to them, and suddenly one of them stretched out his arm and attempted to touch me. I bent over to him. He embraced my neck. Tears flowed on his cheeks, and he said to me in a trembling voice, 'Now I can die more easily. I've been privileged to see a Jewish soldier in Red Army uniform, a Jew who is fighting the Nazis. I can die peacefully, since I know that there is someone who will live on to tell this.'" Ben stood in the court and looked into the eyes of a former friend, neighbour and other man who had taken part in the attempted extermination of his people. "If I hadn't testified," he asked, "who would have? I agree with those who say Sawoniuk should have been tried 50 years ago, but for what that man did, he must face justice. He mustn't get away with living a normal life all that time." But the British court system had to remain neutral, not wanting to hear the millions dead, but about the 21 Jews in particular by Andrei. The prosecution, only interested in the points directly related to the case at hand, a hard task to do, not interested in Ben's time in the Red Army or the things he had seen in the death camps. The court seeked to give the trial without bias and neutrality. The jury expected to put their biases and feelings aside to hear evidence. In his book, The Holocaust, An Unfinished History by Dan Stone, he writes about the difficulty of this approach to the shower. He spoke to Jean-François Lyotard, a French philosopher who served as a medic in Paris during the war, that the reason that trials like this cannot be purely heard in a traditional manner is due to the scale of the crimes committed. It is impossible to show these crimes. Lyotard, the perfect crime does not consist in the killing of the witness or the victim, but rather in obtaining the silence of the witnesses, the deafness of judges, and the insanity of the testimony. In other words, it is an attempt to gain cognitive control over the events of the Holocaust, to master them by fitting them into an existing narrative framework that really constitutes a wrong to the victims. In attempting to counter this wrong, Lyotard puts forward that the notion of the Holocaust as a sublime event, as a sign of history, must be felt rather than known, because it is the magnitude of this event that has rendered the usual instruments of measurement obsolete. The court found it necessary to provide background to the crimes of Andrei, but to be able to convict the accused they required direct witness testimony. The court did not allow memoirs to be submitted as evidence, as the defence were unable to cross-examine the statements and require those who submitted evidence to be in court. Hence, now, two childhood friends stood across from each other, 1,000 miles from the town they grew up in. The following is quoted from the trial of Anthony Sawoniuk, Holocaust testimony under cross-examination by David Hirsch. The court listened in silence to Blustein's shocking testimony as he described in detail the German invasion, the ghettoization of Jews, the main massacre on Yom Kippur 1942, how he hid with his family, how they had unsuccessfully attempted suicide, and how eventually Blustein had been taken prisoner and forced to work at the German base. He was tired and emotional. The mediation of the interpreter made everything more difficult and slow. This was Blustein's Holocaust memoir. Blustein wanted to tell his story, the story of his family, and of the Jews in Damachava. All the emotion made the court, the legal process, uncomfortable. Blustein wanted to tell his story, but the court wanted to hear evidence. Only at the end of his testimony did Blustein mention Andrusha, in passing. He'd told that he had seen a gang of local police harass a Jew called Shania Idel after the main massacre and take him off towards the execution site. He mentioned that he saw Sawoniuk was present. Sawoniuk was not charged with the killing of Shania Idel, yet Blustein, with one remark, had clearly implicated him in his murder. The jury, was not being presented with inadmissible evidence to Andrusha's guilt in a murder of which he was not accused, when in the end the jury came to consider Sawoniuk's guilt or innocence for remaining charges. They must have been influenced by the evidence such as this. In normal life, we put together many disparate pieces of doubtful evidence to make a whole. We add them up in the court, doubtful evidence detracted from, rather than added to add to the clarity of truth. Later, in this case, non-Jewish residents of Damachava came forward to give evidence, some of them having never travelled outside the surroundings of the village, let alone to the streets and courts of London. One, Miss Fedora Yamik, gave the following story. I cut my shoulder one day. My mother bound it up, she put iodine on it. The iodine came through the bandage on my arm as a yellow stain, and Andrusha saw me and shouted, Yud! Yud! to make me stop. Andrusha and some Germans dragged me away to be shot. I was crying and begging, kissing their feet. I was on my knees explaining I was not a Jew and pleading for my life. Andrusha knew me very well, but he didn't protect me. The German pulled off the bandage and saw the wound. He let me go. This was just 1 week after the massacre. Ivan Bagley and his friend, who'd been caught by the local police force and Anthony Sawoniuk looting the Jewish ghetto of the town after the massacre, were marched to the police station. He is quoted as saying, "We thought we were going to be shot. When we came out of the police station, we saw 3 Jews. We realised that we would not be shot, but we would be burying them. We went directly to the sandhills. They were standing by a hole that had been dug out. There were 3 Jews, 2 men and 1 woman. Andrusha ordered them to undress. The men were about 40, they undressed. The woman, about 28, was reluctant to take off her underwear. Andrusha insisted. Andrusha threatened her with a beating. The Jews were emaciated, unshaven, and Andrusha shot the Jews in the back of the head. Bagley and his friend were told to bury the bodies and they could take the clothes. Upon cross-examination, he further spoke about how Andrei had shot each Jew in the back of the head with his pistol and kicked them into the open mass grave in front of them. When Sawoniuk took the stand, he flatly denied everything put forward to him. He denied things that were clear fact, backed with evidence. The ghettos in the towns he visited. He denied ever seeing Jewish people marked with yellow stars. He denied that Jews faced any form of discrimination. He lost his temper upon being asked about his time as a member of the SS, denying it outright, despite the fact the document he used to join the Free Polish Army in 1945 contained the fact that he'd been part of the SS. He and the prosecution went back and forth. Were you ever serving in the German army? I have never joined the German army. We've had that document translated. It says on the 1st of the 8th to the 11th of the 11th, 1944, that the German army, according to his own statement, prove it to me, in black and white. Rubbish. Why does it say so? You are lying in front of the jury, everybody. I hope the jury doesn't believe you. Look at Exhibit 7. Did you ever join the Waffen Border Regiment of the SS? You call me a liar? Twice, I call you a liar. Yes, but did you or didn't you? Never. Don't talk to me about German army. I won't answer no more questions about the German army. How is it that the German SS document contains your name, date of birth, place of birth, Sawoniuk shouting at Griffiths, the detective from the Metropolitan Police Crimes Unit, and other policemen at the back of the court? He printed it! This is a Scotland Yard conspiracy? Yes, probably. All part of a KGB conspiracy. They work together, innit? Are you tired, Mr. Sawoniuk? I am tired enough of you. On one occasion, Sawoniuk became so enraged by Mayor Blustein, another old acquaintance from Damachava, that he screamed at him that he was a Jew boy. At the end of the trial, he was found guilty and given 2 life sentences, and trial judge Mr. Justice Potts remarked that Sawoniuk should spend the rest of his life in prison. He was the first and only person in the United Kingdom to be convicted under the War Crimes Act 1991. From a legal perspective, this case is interesting, as it is also the first time that a British jury had travelled overseas to view the scene of a crime. In 2000, the House of Lords refused him the permission to appeal. Andrei Sawoniuk was interred to Norwich Prison and died after serving 6 years, aged 84 and alone. A few months later, his childhood friend, Ben Zion Blustein, died in Israel, surrounded by a loving family. Thank you for joining us here at So It Goes Productions, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to click on the playlist in the video to continue with the rest of the series. And thank you for watching.